The night was plunged into darkness, the sound of torrential rain hammering the city's empty asphalt. Joanna, a businesswoman, was late for a business flight that could change the course of her career. The clock showed a time dangerously close to the departure of his flight, and chaotic traffic made it impossible to get to the airport on time. With her heart racing and her frustration growing, Joanna decided that her only way to get to the airport before the plane left was to take a taxi. She raised a trembling hand in hopes of finding a vehicle willing to brave the storm. The minutes passed like hours, but finally, the headlights of a taxi appeared through the curtain of rain. The vehicle stopped next to her, water running down the windshield. Joanna hurried to get in, relieved to find a taxi in the middle of the storm. The driver, a middle-aged man with deep lines on his face and somber eyes, turned to look at Joanna as she entered. His gaze seemed penetrating, as if he were sizing her up thoroughly. He didn't say a word, just nodded to indicate that she had gotten into the taxi. Unrest began to grow within Joanna as the taxi advanced along the dark road. The silence was oppressive, and the only soundtrack was the incessant rain beating on the roof of the car. Joanna tried to break the ice, starting a conversation with the driver. "This storm is terrible, isn't it? I'm late for an important flight. Do you think we'll be able to get to the airport in time?" she asked, forcing a smile. The driver didn't respond right away, his eyes fixed on the road. Finally, he mumbled in a monotone voice, "We will arrive." The laconic response made Joanna uncomfortable. She leaned back in the leather seat, looking out the window at the dark, damp room. The minutes passed, and the taxi continued its journey through the storm. However, Joanna noticed something disturbing. They were straying from the usual route to the airport. Unrest grew as the familiar streets were left behind, replaced by unfamiliar scenery. Joanna tried to get the driver's attention. "Wait, I think we're going in the wrong direction. The route to the airport isn't this way," she said, her voice shaking. The driver remained silent, his gaze focused on the dark road. The taxi strayed further and further from the planned route. Joanna began to feel a knot in her stomach, the feeling that something was very wrong. She tried again. "Please take me back to the airport route. I shouldn't be late for my flight." The driver finally spoke, but his words did not ease Joanna's anxiety. His voice was monotonous and empty. "You won't make it to the airport, miss. Not today." Joanna was paralyzed by fear as the reality of the danger she was facing dawned before her. She tried to open the taxi door, but the lock seemed to be sealed, making any escape impossible. The taxi continued to advance through the dark and desolate streets, moving further and further away from the path that led to the airport. The rain beat relentlessly on the car, as if the sky itself shared the tension that filled the interior of the vehicle. Joanna was terrified. Attempts to open the taxi door were futile, and the driver remained silent, as if committed to fulfilling a sinister destiny. His gaze, fixed on the road and monotone voice, made him even more terrifying. "Please stop the car. I need to get to the airport," begged Joanna with a trembling voice. The driver finally broke the silence, but his words increased the fear that enveloped her. "You won't make it to the airport, miss. Not today." The threatening tone of his words made Joanna understand the terrible truth. She was in the hands of a stranger, a man whose intentions were dark and sinister. Desperation took over her, and she looked around for a way out. But the taxi continued to move away from familiar streets, entering increasingly darker neighborhoods far from its original destination. Joanna tried to call the police, but her cell phone had no signal, as if the outside world had completely disappeared. The driver, still without uttering a single word about his plans, maintained his relentless course. The streets they were now traveling through were almost deserted, and Joanna felt that she was increasingly isolated from any help. Her heart beat frantically, and terror gripped her. Finally, the taxi stopped in a remote and desolate place, far away from civilization. Joanna looked out the window, desperately trying to recognize her location. It was as if they were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by deep darkness. The driver turned slowly, his eyes fixed on Joanna. His face, once dark and enigmatic, now wore a macabre smile. "We have arrived, miss. This is where your journey ends." The fear that coursed through Joanna's body was unbearable. She knew she was in a life-or-death situation, and the fight for survival became her only priority. With a fit of courage, Joanna took her bag and used it to hit the driver. She attacked him with frantic blows, and in a moment of surprise, he lost control of the taxi. The vehicle left the road and stopped on a dirt bank with a violent jolt. Joanna saw the opportunity and didn't hesitate. She opened the taxi door and ran out into the darkness. The rain was still falling mercilessly, but freedom was within reach. She didn't look back, just ran, leaving the taxi and the sinister driver behind. The escape through the darkness was a race for her life, but Joanna was determined to survive. As the storm continued to batter the town, she finally found shelter in a small, abandoned cabin in the middle of nowhere. She locked the door behind her, catching her breath as the rain fell. Joanna was safe, at least for now, but the mystery of the sinister driver and his evil intentions haunted her. She knew that this night of terror was far from over, and the challenge of surviving was just beginning. Inside the abandoned hut, Joanna tried to catch her breath, while the rain outside continued to punish the world with its fury. The drops hit the tin roof, creating a sound that echoed in Joanna's mind, reminding her of her terrible journey through the rainy night. The cabin was dark and dusty, the furniture covered in stained, aged sheets. Joanna sat in one of the corners, shaking with fear and uncertainty. She knew she couldn't stay there forever, but she also had no idea what was happening and who the sinister driver was who had tried to take her to a dark destination. As her shaking hand searched her bag for her cell phone, Joanna noticed something disturbing. On the walls of the hut, strange bloody inscriptions were drawn in a dark red tone. Unlit candles were arranged in a circle around the inscriptions, and a sick feeling grew in her stomach. Joanna grabbed her cell phone, desperate to call for help. But once again, disappointment hit her when she realized she still had no signal. She was completely isolated, lost in the middle of nowhere. While trying to create an escape plan, Joanna heard a sound coming from outside the cabin. Heavy, shuffling footsteps echoed in the darkness. She stood still, eyes fixed on the door, as the footsteps slowly approached. The door creaked as someone pushed it open, and, to Joanna's horror, the sinister driver entered the cabin. His face, a mask of insanity, looked at her with a blood-curdling smile. He was completely soaked by the rain, but his gaze seemed to be in another world. "Did you think you could escape, miss?" he whispered in an icy voice, as if he was far from reality. Joanna backed away, her mind racing in search of a way out. She noticed a candle burning next to her, and a terrible plan began to form in her mind. With a quick movement, she picked up the candle and threw it towards the bloody writings on the floor. The flames spread instantly, creating a wall of fire that blocked the taxi driver. The man screamed in pain, his figure obscured by the dancing flames. Joanna knew she only had a few moments to escape. She ran towards the door, which was now partially obstructed by fire, and forced it open. The torrential rain welcomed her outside, and she ran as fast as she could, leaving the cabin and the terrifying driver behind. However, the relief of his escape was ephemeral. She was still somewhere remote, in a raging storm, and her situation remained dangerous and uncertain. The mystery of the sinister driver and the meaning of the bloody inscriptions tormented her. She knew that this night of horror was not over yet, and that the challenge of surviving was far from over. Joanna continued her escape under the relentless storm. Her body shook with fear and exhaustion, but the need to survive drove her forward. She ran along dark, unfamiliar roads, trying to find some sign of civilization or help. The cold rain soaked his clothes and hair, making his search even more challenging. With each flash of lightning, she searched for any trace of human life nearby. Even the sight of a predator or creature of the night seemed less threatening than the sinister driver who had pursued her. As Joanna ran, her mind was full of unanswered questions. Who was the driver? What did he want with her? And what was the meaning of the bloody inscriptions and candles in the hut? Finally, after a long run, Joanna saw the lights of a distant gas station. She picked up her pace, hoping to find help or a phone to call the police. Her muscles ached, and she was on the verge of exhaustion, but the prospect of escaping her pursuer kept her going. When she arrived at the gas station, she hurried inside, looking for someone who could help her. But the scene that unfolded before her left her astonished. The people at the gas station didn't seem to notice his presence. They were motionless, like mannequins, with empty eyes staring into space. Joanna tried to get their attention, but their voices came out as inaudible whispers. She was trapped in a nightmare, in a place where reality seemed to have lost its meaning. The people standing still at the gas station stared at her, their mouths not moving, their eyes lifeless. Determined to escape this strange nightmare, Joanna ran to the gas station phone and tried to dial the police number. But when he picked up the receiver, the same silent hum responded. She couldn't make a call, just like her previous attempt. Desperate, Joanna returned to the torrential rain and decided to keep running. Maybe, somewhere, she would find help or a safe place. The city that had once seemed familiar now frightened her with its strangeness. The streets were empty and darkness dominated everything. However, her escape was cut short when, as she turned a corner, she came across the sinister driver standing in the middle of the street. His eyes still wore that look of insanity, but now there was a cruel smile on his face. "You can't escape, miss. You're trapped here, in this eternal nightmare," he murmured, his voice echoing like an ominous whisper. Joanna was trapped. Her pursuer blocked her on one side, and the motionless people at the gas station waited for her on the other. She was about to lose all hope when a flash of anger and courage washed over her. She ran towards the driver and attacked him with all her strength, violently pushing him to the side. He fell, and Joanna wasted no time. She continued her escape, ignoring the look of astonishment that now filled the empty eyes of the people at the gas station. The rain continued to fall, relentlessly, but Joanna did not give up. She finally found a payphone and dialed the emergency number. When the attendant's voice sounded on the other end, Joanna burst into tears, explaining her chaotic situation. Police quickly arrived at the scene and found her in a state of shock. She was taken to safety, where she explained her terrifying experience. Authorities began an investigation, but upon returning to the cabin and gas station, they found no clues that could explain what Joanna had experienced. The night of terror that began in that taxi and led her to a bizarre nightmare remained unanswered. The sinister driver, the motionless people, and the bloody inscriptions remained a mystery. Joanna had survived, but the emotional scars of that night would follow her forever, and the sinister stories she lived would become an urban legend, a true horror story that would haunt the city, a kind of real-life creepypasta, one of the most horror stories. Disturbing and scary stories told by starlight and shared with shivers of fear. Whatever had happened that night, Joanna knew that the terror she had faced was more than a mere nightmare. It was an experience that defied understanding and would haunt her for the rest of her life.